Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our first episode and presentation of the Mini Psychology School, brought to you by the Collaborative Network for Training and Excellence in Psychotraumatology, also known as Context. My name is Larissa Sherwood, and I am a doctoral researcher and research fellow in the Context program, and I'm based at Trinity College in Dublin. This is the first of 12 in our series covering a range of topics in psychology, including case studies from childhood trauma all the way through to the humanitarian worker. Today's discussion will be focused around the risks associated with policing and specifically looking at the post-conflict context of Northern Ireland, using the Police Service of Northern Ireland as a case study. And just before we begin, if you haven't had a chance to read the attached case study, that is okay. You will be able to follow this presentation. However, you may want to refer back to the case study for further information and just for more depth. And as I said, Context is a collaborative network of organizations and institutions, including academic sectors, so 3 universities, as well as a variety of non-academic institutions that you can see here. So for today's discussion, we'll be focusing on the Police Service of Northern Ireland. Now, before we get started with the presentation, I just want to pose a really simple question, and that is, what is being a police officer? Some of you might think about that terrible feeling of looking in the rearview mirror and there's the light from a police car as you're being pulled over. Some of you might think of the old saying, to protect and serve, but it's really important that no matter how you conceptualize what being a police officer means or is, that there's a lot of risks and stress associated with working in the police. Being a police officer at its core is dealing with all the problems in society that people either can't, won't, or even shouldn't have to deal with. Working in law enforcement is commonly known as a very high risk and high stress occupation, and overall mental health problems are on the rise for police officers in the United Kingdom as well as in other various countries around the world. And this is important when we look at the context that we'll come back to a bit later in this presentation of Northern Ireland when we're looking at this high risk, high stress aspect of the occupation. So something just to keep in mind. So a little bit of a statistics from the Blue Light Scoping Survey, also the Mind Survey, which is a mental health organization, shows that 9 out of 10 officers have experienced poor mental health and stress at work. Now, while we all experience some sort of stress and maybe at times poor mental health due to our work, we don't always have to seek assistance. It doesn't really bring us to the point for most people that they must, outsource and reach to gain some assistance in that area, some psychological help. However, for police officers, more than half of them have sought help for mental health or well-being in just the last year alone. So what we see is the stress associated with working as an officer is actually manifesting itself in these officers, leading them to seek help for their well-being and their mental health. Now, if we look specifically at Northern Ireland in context and Police Service of Northern Ireland, which I'll refer to as the PSNI moving forward, overall stress-related illness makes up a significant proportion of the number of days that officers are taking off due to sickness. In fact, so much so that over 37,500 days were taken off last year just to mental health alone. And that's a 60% increase that we've seen over 3 years. What's also really important to think about in this statistic is the fact that these are reported cases of missing work due to mental health. We'll touch more on this later, but we have to bear in mind the stigma associated with poor mental health and policing. It's very rare to have officers come forward and saying that they're taking time off because of their mental well-being. So the numbers here are probably underrepresented, but it is still quite a large proportion of officers. So in the last 5 years, nearly 2,000 officers have had to take sick leave due to stress and poor mental health. And now that's of a population of just over 6,500 officers. So a pretty large number. And that resulted in 106,870 days taken off of duty and averaging more than 11 weeks per officer to have taken that sick leave. So on average, when an officer is coming off of work due to mental health, they're taking an average of 11 weeks time off. Just to compare against the UK as a whole, we see here that there's been a 60% increase in over the last 3 years. Generally across the UK, we've actually seen psychological related sick absence increase by approximately 35%. So when we're looking at Northern Ireland in particular, the figures here are significantly higher. And this is a real problem. Mark Lindsay, who's the chairman of the Police Federation of Northern Ireland, which is essentially the union of the PSNI, had made a statement recently saying that this level of stress signposts the need for urgent action to be taken to address real concerns about officer welfare. The Police Federation has actually put forward more than £1 million in addressing mental health of police officers. So I want to talk about a few of the domains of stress. So we really all do have different types of stress. As I said before, we've probably been stressed in our jobs before. And again, personal stress. These are things like finances, relationships, illness or bereavement of a loved one, these sorts of things. And we all have these personal stressors in our lives. But officers also have the work-related stress that they're impacted by. So this falls into two categories. Primarily, we're looking at the organizational and the operational stress. And again, across these three domains of stress, we see an impact of the post-conflict setting in Northern Ireland as well, which we will continue to delve deeper into throughout this presentation. There are some key risk factors that have been identified in regards to types of personal stress or personal risk factors. So gender, female officers are twice as likely as men to experience anxiety and depression. And then we also have various different personality characteristics as types of risk. So being introverted, emotional stability, and hardiness, these are all different areas of personality which can be a risk factor or a protective factor depending on the personality trait. We also have sleep quality, which has been identified as a risk factor. We have relationship status, so whether you're divorced or single, it actually shows that individuals who are not married or are not in a significant relationship or are in a relationship breakdown are at a higher risk of psychological distress. And social support. Social support we'll see time and time again throughout this presentation. It's really a key aspect of psychological risk for officers. And then we also have previous trauma, particularly childhood traumas that have happened. These certainly serve as risk factors for adverse mental health outcomes. And particularly when we're looking at an area of conflict or post-conflict situation, there is a lot of civilian trauma that has happened in those countries or those cities. There is a significant amount of traumas that have happened in those areas. And particularly looking at PSNI, we have security-related risks. So not only is there a risk associated with being a police officer and being in the field, being on duty, all of these things, but there's actually a real personal risk when we're looking at the context of Northern Ireland. So there's certainly the threat of terror against the officer and their families. And this could lead to something known as SPED, which is a special purchase of evacuated dwellings, which is essentially when an officer, and they've been identified as potentially a target of terrorism from paramilitary groups. They can be forced to leave their house within as little as 24 or 48 hours for the protection of themselves and their families. So there's a real personal effect here when we're looking at the context of Northern Ireland and policing. Next, we have organizational stress. Again, all organizations will have some sort of stress associated with them, but there are some key risk factors here when we're looking at policing in specific. The first of those would be a lack of regular preparatory and follow-up sessions. So this could be things like various types of training and follow-up trainings and debriefings following a potentially traumatic event or critical incident. So we have social support from colleagues. Again, that social support is coming up here. Very, very important. If there's a lack of social support, then it's very, very difficult for officers to decompress and to have a shared understanding of the role. High workload, which is really difficult because we've got budget cuts, and then that leads to a reduced number of staff, increasing the workload for the current employees. And this excessive workload, especially in some specialist roles, officers are working more than double the recommended amount of cases at any given time. Then we, of course, have job stress. There's a variety of different types of job stress that can be identified as risk factors. So this is things like job demand, overcommitment, effort, control, inflexible working hours, perceived unfairness, role ambiguity, work overload. So all of these things you can see are types of job stress, and they can lead to being a risk factor for poor mental health. And I've also bolded here mental health stigma. This is a really difficult area for many officers in terms of actually being able to discuss their mental well-being and the effects that these critical incidents and potentially traumatic exposures could have on their mental health. Police service is a very distinct culture. It's a very masculine culture. There's a fear of being demoted if you're not strong enough or mentally tough enough, potentially having your firearm removed from you if an opportunity came to be promoted, that you may have to take a back seat to that if you've discussed any difficulties with your mental health. So there's certainly a really big stigma around mental health, and therefore a lack of emotional support from colleagues, which ties back into that social support we outlined earlier. And we can really see this happening from the top down. And what I mean by you can see this top down, this psychological stigma, is that the Police Service of Northern Ireland Chief Constable, who was the top of the organization, had made a comment to a fellow officer, a constable, who was struggling with depression, struggling with the stresses of the job and everything that it was requiring of him, and it had eventually taken its toll on the officer. But in response to that on Twitter, Chief Constable Hamilton made a comment stating, "Well, you're allowed to leave and seek another job. No one's asking you to stay. Dry your eyes, do the job, or move on." So there's this rhetoric that's reverberating from the top tiers of the Police Service of Northern Ireland all the way down through the rankings to the constables. And this is certainly seen throughout the culture of the PSNI. So when we're talking about police culture, it's really important to notice that police culture is not conducive to emotional expression. There's a lot of stigma attached to emotional weakness, and this term weakness is where a lot of this stigma comes from. Being emotionally vulnerable makes you weak in many of these ideas of this stigma. And there's a fear of losing opportunities, as I said, from promotions, having your firearm taken away, or being demoted even. And overall, the bravado and the masculine culture of policing can have significant consequences for the overall mental health of officers. The combination of exposure to high stress or traumatic situations combined with stigma around mental health and not being able to access social support and social networks actually has a really profound effect on the psychological outcomes of police officers, particularly when we're looking at post-traumatic stress disorder. So here are a couple of quotes that were found in the literature surrounding this topic that show the effect really of poor social support and stigma that can have on the mental health of first responders and police officers. The combination of exposure to critical incidents and the suppression of normal human emotions, remembering that these are normal emotions to abnormal events. So the suppression of normal human emotions makes police officers vulnerable to the development of PTSD symptoms. So if we really break down that quote, we can see that this combination, again, the exposure to critical incidents, as well as this stigma of not being able to discuss the emotions and the difficulties and the psychological distress that occurs from these incidents, actually makes officers more vulnerable to developing PTSD. So we can see why social support is playing such a key role. And the second quote here is that long-term withholding or covering of emotional reactions has been linked to poor physical and psychological health among emergency first responders. So this concept goes beyond just policing, and it really encompasses a variety of the first responders who are meant to be strong, masculine, very psychologically robust. But unfortunately, we're all human, and no matter how resilient these officers or these emergency responders are, it still takes its toll being exposed to these potentially traumatic situations alongside the various organizational stressors and personal stressors that are happening. So for the final domain, we have operational stress. And now this is probably the area that most people think of when they think about stress in policing, is actually being on duty in the line of duty. So officers are, of course, exposed to high levels of stress and exposed to traumatic materials. So we have first responders who could be called to a road traffic fatality or to an active crime scene where someone has threatened to harm themselves or others. We have quite a lot of this anticipatory stress. So there's a very diverse range of calls. They're very inconsistent. There's minimal time to prepare in their heads what they're going to do at the scene. And then of course the exposure to violent and graphic materials on a regular basis. So this is what we really think about when we talk about police trauma or stress or psychological distress. It's probably more where most of our heads go are these type of incidents, being called out to a shooting or a violent scene. But really it goes a lot deeper than that, because a lot of times these officers are very well prepared and they know the job that they're doing. So most of the time these things don't come as too much of a surprise. But what we see are that there are some high-risk clusters. And now it's not necessarily high-risk roles, so looking at the first responder versus the public protection unit versus the family liaison officer. There's a variety of roles, but it's more looking at who's more high risk. So the cluster of high-risk roles for community division officers, they were found to be high risk in a research study by Habersat. And these high-risk clusters were characterized by lower subjective social status in the community or in the country and among friends, lower decision latitude, lower support from colleagues and superiors, and lower problem-focused coping and higher loneliness compared to the low-risk clusters. So again, even in the operational stress, there's a lot of referencing back to the social support. We also have the frequency of exposure. So the more frequent that an officer is exposed to critical incidents or potentially traumatic material or events, the more of a risk that they are at for developing adverse reactions to this exposure. Killing or seriously injuring someone in the line of duty has been shown to be a severe risk factor, and just being involved in a shooting incident as well, particularly where there's direct threat and harm to the individual. And it's been shown that the closer an individual is to the actual event of being harmed, the more psychologically distressing this can be. So although involvement in a shooting incident is quite rare, seriously harming or killing someone in the line of duty, they are very significant. And then of course we have the very specific security-related threat for the PSNI. And very much so this is being the target of an attack. Officers are frequently attacked just for being a police officer, given the context and the nature of the situation in Northern Ireland. Then we also have policing during riots and these community violence that happen. There is various different parades, riots in various communities, which police officers are then left to police and calm down the riots. But unfortunately, they often become the center of attack, individuals throwing petrol bombs at them, throwing large stones and bricks. They are guarded by their shields and they have water cannons and they have quite large, almost military grade policing vehicles for these incidents. So it is a very, very high risk situation and there's a lot of stress involved in that. And then you also have this more of a nuanced issue of having your photo taken by the public. More and more we see officers being either recorded and posted on social media and all of these sorts of things, which I think is in practice is good because we're holding the officers accountable for their actions in these things. But really when we're looking at Northern Ireland in the context there, it could be very, very detrimental and quite threatening to the officer if they are identified as working for the police. That they could then in turn be the target of an attack. There's a real risk there at this point with having photos taken, and more so particularly with being identified as being a police officer, because most officers in Northern Ireland will not say that they work for the PSNI because there's still far too high of a security related risk there and threat. There's obviously this operational stress that happens and all of the exposure to this traumatic material and these traumatic events that officers are constantly faced with. But traumatic exposure is not, of course, unique to policing. It's also not uncommon. So here's a map that we can see of the prevalence of traumatic exposure. And this was really the epidemiology of traumatic exposure events worldwide. And this was done from the World Mental Health Survey Consortium. And so really what they did is they did a general population survey across 24 countries with a combined sample of nearly 69,000 adult respondents across 6 continents. They assessed exposure to 29 various traumatic event types. So the results showed that over 70% of respondents reported a traumatic event, and more than 30% were exposed to 4 or more traumas. We can see that the prevalence of exposure is quite high, and so this is not uncommon. The exposure experienced by officers, it's much higher due to the nature of their work. And so even though more than 70% of people reported any traumatic event in their lifetime, we're seeing that on average, those individuals are experiencing about 3.3 traumatic events in their lifetime. For every 6 months of service, there's approximately 3 traumatic incidents for every officer. And now these fluctuate. Some officers are exposed to more than 3 traumatic incidents a day, and some officers aren't exposed to hardly any traumatic incidents, maybe 1 or 2 a year, just depending on the nature of their role. 2 out of 3 officers have faced a life-threatening situation within their first 24 months of service. So again, if we come back to what we were talking about before, about the exposure to these traumatic experiences, and the closer you are to them, the more life-threatening they are, the more likely you are to develop adverse reactions. This really hones in on that and really highlights the importance of this topic in discussing police trauma and resilience and well-being and psychological distress, because 2/3 of officers face a life-threatening situation in their first 24 months of service. That is quite a large portion of these officers in such a short space of their service time. So when we're talking about police trauma, we really want to look at 3 variations on trauma. So the first is primary trauma, and that's what we've been talking a lot about, is the experience of an extremely stressful event which was perceived as a threat to a person's life or well-being, and this is often combined with feelings of extreme helplessness or an inability to cope. So again, some examples could be exchanging gunfire, witnessing death, or even being assaulted. So that's the primary trauma. This is what we tend to think of when there's trauma involved in a critical incident. Then we have secondary trauma. So secondary trauma is learning about the trauma from another person and experiencing emotional duress, taking witness statements. So this could be discussing a domestic abuse case or taking statements, a robbery. So you're taking statements and you're still being exposed to trauma, but now this is just a secondary trauma. And then we also have this newer concept, vicarious trauma. And this often results from working with individuals who have experienced trauma, and this is built up over time. An example of that could be that repetitive exposure to child exploitation, and that can lead to burnout. So the primary and secondary traumas are often led to stress-related disorders, and things like post-traumatic stress disorder, and the vicarious trauma here we know can lead to professional burnout. And this is sort of a new construct that's been coming up more in the literature, and I would certainly urge you to delve a little bit deeper into these various types of trauma to more thoroughly understand the psychological consequences of trauma. So we've talked a little bit about the 3 domains of stress and those risk factors, the personal, organizational, and operational. And now I just want to touch a little bit more on what those mean in a post-conflict setting. So the key risk factors for poor mental health, we know poor psychological condition is a key risk factor. We know that assault with intent to injure is a key risk factor, confrontation with the legal system, the frequency of traumatic events, exposure to direct life threat, and high personal threat during a critical incident to an officer. So all of these risk factors that are relevant throughout the literature could certainly be heightened in a post-conflict setting. Now, there's not a lot of literature around psychological risk factors for policing in post-conflict settings, but we can make this idea based around the general literature that is available for policing. And as I said, there's also very little research on post-conflict police settings and those risk factors of adverse mental health outcomes. But we do know that these have been identified as key risk factors, and we also can make the link that these sort of events happen more commonly in conflict and post-conflict situations. So now I want to talk a little bit more about post-conflict setting in Northern Ireland. So we've had a snapshot of the general risks associated with policing and a little bit on adverse mental health outcomes and policing in post-conflict settings in Northern Ireland. But what about when you added another element of security-related risk? So just to touch on, especially for those who haven't had a chance to read through the case study background on the Troubles in Northern Ireland. So the Troubles are a 30-year period marked with insurgency and intercommunal violence between Unionists and Nationalists. Now, the Unionists are those who are often Protestant and are pro being a part of the United Kingdom, where nationalists tend to be more Catholic background, and they would prefer the north of Ireland to become a part of Ireland as one country. Appeared to be on the verge of a civil war even, and these tensions can lead all the way back to the 19th century when we had the inception of the province over home rule bills and the Northern Ireland partition from Ireland. So this is still very much a rhetoric that is alive and present today, and even in a post-conflict situation. As a result of civilian rights issues, civil unrest came to an all-time high in 1969 with riots happening all across the province. And so much so that in 1969, Britain decided that they needed to send in their army. This is an unprecedented act in an attempt to maintain control. And really, this was in reference to Battle of Bogside, which lasted more than 50 hours, where police were using rubber bullets and tear gas in that attempt to maintain control over the crowds, which they couldn't. The start of the Troubles and the opposition to the police force in Northern Ireland. So with that, more than 300,000 troops were deployed to Northern Ireland during the Troubles. And at first, the army was very welcomed by both sides as a neutral party, but it soon became resistant to their presence. So now, just to give you a little bit of an idea of the actual situation and the setting at the very beginning of the Troubles, the Battle of Bogside in 1969, where the troops were deployed to Northern Ireland, to Derry, Londonderry. I want to show this short minute-and-a-half video footage of the actual incident known as Battle of Bogside, and you can really see the disruption and the civil unrest happening in Northern Ireland, which really set the tone for the next 30 years of the conflict.
August 1969. The disaffected Catholic population of the Bogside took to the streets to confront the Royal Ulster Constabulary in the wake of a Protestant apprentice boys' parade in the city. The violence, which was a manifestation of long-standing political grievances, was so extreme that in an unprecedented step, British troops were deployed into Derry. This decision by the British government under Prime Minister Harold Wilson was to shape the future of Northern Ireland for over 30 years.
They moved straight into one of the worst-hit streets on the edge of the Bogside, carrying with them their ready-made barbed wire barricades and lining up in battle formation across the street where the air was foul with smoke and tear gas. The stones and petrol bombs ceased, and slowly the Bogside fighters approached the newly installed barbed wire barricades.
Using previously unseen archive footage, we reveal the inside story of what became known as the Battle of the Bogside.
From that video, you can really see the severity of the situation in Northern Ireland and how quickly it had escalated with 50 hours of rioting and violence, enough so that the British Army were deployed. And what we really see here is that what was only meant to last a couple of months for the Operation Banner was officially its name, ended up being the longest continuous deployment in British history to date. And this deployment was really only supposed to last a couple of months, but it continued on for 38 long years. So this violence continued to heighten regardless of having the army there, regardless of the RUC, which is now the PSNI. The violence continued to heighten with the organization of paramilitary groups on both sides. Most notably would be the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA, on the nationalist side, and the Ulster Defence Association, the Ulster Volunteer Force, on the unionist side. With this violence, we saw several fatalities and casualties. In total, more than 3,500 people were killed during the Troubles and more than 50,000 injured as a result of murders, shootings, bombings, rioting, the civil unrest. But in 1998, the Good Friday Agreement was signed by both sides of the conflict and was a very promising step in the peace process in the hope of moving past the sectarian violence. However, the dissident groups continued to present armed campaigns using explosives and firearms. This is what led the army to having to stay for 38 years, and it wasn't even until 2007, nearly 10 years after signing the Good Friday Agreement, that the army actually left. With the British Army no longer deployed in Northern Ireland, the PSNI has to take take on the responsibility and the role to combat the threat from dissident groups, while also trying to serve as police officers in protecting the community, enforcing the law, and maintaining civil order. And this is a very, very difficult job for the PSNI officers to have, because in 2016, the Security Service of the UK, an MI5, actually raised the national threat level in Britain from moderate to substantial as a result of the Northern Irish related terror threat. And currently in Northern Ireland, we are still classified as severe threat against police officers. So a very difficult job that these officers have now, not only maintaining their jobs as police, but also in some ways having to militarize their service. So as a result of the militarization of the police force during the Troubles and during this time, once we established a post-conflict society, it was really important to encourage police reform. So the Police Service of Northern Ireland, as I had mentioned earlier, were previously known as the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and they were the police force in Northern Ireland from 1922 to 2001. But on the 4th of November 2001, the RUC became the Police Service of Northern Ireland, and during the Troubles, the RUC was working alongside the British Army in order to restore order and maintain order in the conflicted state. But once the RUC underwent police reform and became the Police Service of Northern Ireland, there was this real encouragement to demilitarize the police and to really reduce the divide between the police and the public. There was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of hesitation and resistance to the police, granted the situation throughout the Troubles. There was an increased difficulty of implementing reform, especially in the PSNI, because there was a severe lack of resources to do so. Since 2004, budget cuts totaling nearly £400 million have been implemented. So trying to return to a protect and serve police mentality and shift away from this militarized approach is quite difficult. And a huge part of the ongoing reform has been to establish this good relationships between the police and the public, but doing so with really limited resources has proven quite difficult to do. We see that officers are working longer hours with reduced resources, budget cuts, and they're trying to do all of this while they're reforming and working in this post-conflict setting. But unfortunately, the current threat level against PSNI officers from dissident paramilitary groups is still classified as severe. And a recent survey done by the Police Federation of Northern Ireland found that 4 out of 5 officers were the victim of a physical or verbal assault in the past year. So although there's been police reform, we're now in a post-conflict setting, there is really a strong level of threat against being a police officer. And this comes from working in that post-conflict setting. So when we look at various different post-conflict settings, we do know that there's high rates of psychological trauma amongst the population. So we have a few statistics here for a lifetime prevalence of PTSD. For example, Japan, it's as low as 1.3%, Spain 2.2%, South Africa 2.3%, Italy 2.4%, and then we have Northern Ireland hitting it nearly 9%. 8.8%. So this is the highest rate of PTSD that we see anywhere in the world, and it's suggested that up to 40% of the population have had a conflict-related traumatic incident. So it's very much a real situation, and there's very high rates of psychological trauma and distress amongst the general population, of which police officers are, of course, part of the general population as well. So they are at that increased risk just from living in Northern Ireland, given the context of the conflict. Then we have this idea of the unstable government, which is common across conflict and post-conflict settings. At the moment, there is no government in Northern Ireland. Stormont, which is where the political representatives go, the MLAs, it's actually been essentially shut down over a divide between the political parties. They cannot come to an agreement. So they have been out of their offices for nearly a year and a half, and there's really no government at all functioning in Northern Ireland. And then we also have this heightened violence. So attacks from dissident groups, riots, community violence is still something that is happening, even though we're in the post-conflict setting. This heightened violence is particularly high at times of the year called marching season, which tends to be through the month of July. We would see a lot of heightened violence during those times, particularly with the idea of bonfires and rioting, and this community violence of us versus them on both sides, from the nationalists and the unionists. Again, you can read more about some of these topics in that case study. So how do we police in an environment like this? How does policing function in a post-conflict society? Well, it can really impact the individual, the organization, the operational risks that an officer faces. We've touched on all before. Working in a society that's divided by conflict increases the dangers associated with policing, particularly when there's hostile feelings from the public towards the police who are serving the communities. We talked a bit about the police reform where they've demilitarized the police, they've reduced the divide between the public, but then we also have these additional risk factors that I have touched on several times because they are so crucial and important to the mental health and well-being of these officers. So we have the personal threat and the security related threat, which really overlap as a result of being an officer. So we have the three domains, the personal, the organizational, and the operational, but really the stress that's associated with being an officer in Northern Ireland hits across all three of those domains. There's a real sense of this personal threat and security. Many officers are the target of this violence, as we've discussed. Officers are still checking under their cars for car bombs, which it's not uncommon for them to still be happening today, where individuals actually do target officers with lethal intent. So most officers still check under their car every day. Officers do not drive in their uniforms to work. They're encouraged to take different routes home, to and from work. There's a real risk and threat there. So when we're talking about these risk factors for PSNI officers, what are the additional risk factors that are really not only key to post-conflict settings and just policing in general, but in Northern Ireland? And what we see is the riots and the community violence, the petrol bombs being attacked or ambushed, SPED, the identification of an officer. We've talked about so many of these different areas, being the target of an attack with lethal intent just due to being in uniform, being identified as a police officer, and then being the target. And there's also this real difficulty of being able to leave the job, even if an officer has been in their job for some time and they've made the decision to step down or to step away from being a police officer. There's a lot of risk associated with that, as security risk continues even after you leave the police. So it's really difficult to find a new job having to disclose your position within the PSNI. So even if someone does want to leave and they go to their new potential employer and they have to submit their CV or their resume, there's a lot of fear around disclosing that they were a part of the PSNI. So even if they feel that they would like to go to an alternative route with their career, it's very, very difficult. And that itself leads as a potential risk factor for these officers feeling stuck in the job. And even if they wanted to leave, could they actually implement a change there in their own lives due to the security risk involved? So just touching on some of the current threats have been officers just over the last couple of years. You can read again about more of this in the case study, but a near fatal shooting with an officer by an AK-47 assault rifle while an officer was sat in a patrol car filling up their tank with gas with petrol. Also interesting to note that no police officer will ever ride alone. They always ride in teams. Pipe bombs thrown at police officers in an attempt to murder them. Smashed police vehicle windows when two officers were under attack again in Carrickfergus. More than 100 petrol bombs and gunfire aimed at police during a security alert in County Antrim. These all happened within the last 2 years. So very, very much a serious security threat, even in this post-conflict situation. Now we're going to watch a short video clip put together from the Police Federation of Northern Ireland. This, along with several other videos, were part of a campaign known as We Are You. These videos were released in response to the ongoing threat and security risk against police officers. And the point of the videos is to really highlight the difficult nature of the job, but also to really humanize the police officers, to show that they too have families and loved ones. They too are mothers, fathers, children. So in response to this ongoing security threat and risk that you see posed against officers, also in the beginning of the video, you can see the mother checking under her car. You can see, and that's checking under the car for the car bombs, as most officers do. You can see that she doesn't go to work in a uniform, but instead has her rucksack where she's keeping her uniform until she gets to the station. And then you can also see that there is a bomb scare and an actual an attack. So these are all events that are not uncommon throughout Northern Ireland. So we'll go ahead and watch this quick video clip.
Come here. You be a good boy for your daddy today, okay? Mom. Bye, love.
Bye, honey.
Alpha Delta 7, 0, suspect package in vehicle, request ATO.
Roger. Tom, dinner.
Possible secondary device.
In addition to the series of videos used for the We Are You campaign, the Police Federation, and particularly the chairman, Mark Lindsay, has made several comments about the threat to police officers, and this one being one of them from the chairman's address at their annual PSNI conference. The attacks were different. The aim was the same, to inflict as much damage as the attackers could manage on officers who placed themselves in harm's way to protect the public they serve. The men and women I'm proud to represent are under daily attack. They are assaulted on the streets when they try to restore order. They are assaulted in homes when they try to protect the vulnerable. They are also under attack from a government that refuses to acknowledge that continued austerity and the denial of essential resources will have such a damaging effect on police and society that it would take generations to restore. It's a sad reflection of where we are in 2017. We are still expected to police an environment where such lethal weaponry is used against police officers. So this was just in May 2017, so just about a year ago, this address was given. As you can see from the video, as well as the chairman's address, that there's high levels of stress as well as potentially traumatic situations that officers are faced with. And all of these certainly do have the potential for adverse mental health consequences. So when we're looking at these consequences of trauma and stress on police officers, what does it really mean? Stress can lead to a lack of sensory perception and fine motor skills, so therefore a reduced ability to perform well at work. There's a financial burden, of course, to stress-related sick days, a high incidence of work-related mental illness, so we see a lot of PTSD, anxiety, and depression. Millions of pounds are lost having to take time off in relation to mental illness. And officers cannot sleep well, they're hypervigilant, aggressive, and they may isolate themselves. These may be some of the symptoms that you see with PTSD, anxiety, and depression. Then we also see high turnover of staff, and this is due to burnout and compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma as well. What we see is that up to 50% of officers in some specialist roles are experiencing burnout, and that up to 30% of staff in these specialist roles could be experiencing PTSD. So a significant number of officers potentially experiencing these adverse mental health consequences. So we have much higher rates of PTSD, anxiety, and depression than the general population. And for some studies, it's estimated that PTSD is actually 5 times higher for police officers than for the general population. All of these consequences of stress and trauma also have a cumulative effect. If the officers aren't able to diffuse the stress associated with the traumatic exposure and the stress, this can lead to very serious physical and psychological health problems, ranging from heart disease all the way through to depression. And this cumulative trauma is really a buildup of the various potentially traumatic experiences on the individual. And this combination of trauma and stress has profound effects, particularly when the stress and trauma is persistent and chronic. It makes it more difficult to address and reduce this stress because it's reducing the resilience. Every time that a stressful or traumatic event is happening, it's really building up on that individual. And this routine cumulative stress can cause persons to become more vulnerable in traumatic events and contributes to the risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's so important to look at this cycle of stress and trauma building up through time and the effects that really can have on officers' mental health and well-being. Just a few final thoughts before we wrap up. Officers are exposed to various domains of stress and trauma, personal, organizational, and operational, all of which we touched on, and the officers are very resilient. and they do receive training. They do understand what's expected of them, and that a first responder could very likely encounter a dead body or a violent scene. Officers they know this, but at the same time, they're at a very heightened risk of stress and trauma exposure, and they are only human, and these things do take their toll. So all of these must be considered when we're identifying the risks of poor mental health outcomes, because these additional stressors in conflict and post-conflict settings are very real as well. And these can have a very big impact on officers' mental health and well-being, and the rates at which they're exposed to the traumas. And this accumulation of stress and traumatic exposure can have a significant effect on officer mental health and well-being. Thank you for joining us on the first episode of the Mini Psychology series brought to you by Context. We would love if you would join us on Facebook. You can look us up at Context, the Global Psychotraumatology Network. Also, you can visit us at www.psychotraumanetwork.com to read more about each of the 12 projects, as well as the different organizations that we are collaborating with. And I would also just like to say a big thank you to the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program, for which this project and the other Fellows projects have received funding under the Marie Curie Grant. If you have any questions for myself, we are going to be having an open discussion following this presentation now. And also feel free to email me with any further questions you might have.